The night of November 3rd, 2004, began like any other quiet evening in northern Michigan, with the cold wind moving softly over the dark water of Pine Harbor Lake and the street lamps glowing in pale circles along the narrow roads. Most people in the town of Riverton were already inside their homes, settling into warm living rooms, shutting out the early winter chill. No one knew that the next few hours would become the darkest chapter in their town's memory, the kind of mystery that would stay alive for nearly 2 decades and haunt every person who ever joined the search for a young woman named Maren Ellis. She was only 24, bright-eyed, soft-spoken, and loved by almost anyone who knew her. The last image ever captured of her on that night was from the small camera mounted above the entrance of the Lakeside General Store where she worked the closing shift. In the video, she pushed the glass door open just after 9:07 p.m., pulling her knitted purple scarf tighter around her neck as she stepped into the cold. Her breath left soft clouds in the air, her boots scraped the pavement lightly, and she glanced over her shoulder just once, as if sensing someone behind her, though the footage showed no one. She crossed the small parking area toward her pale silver sedan, keys already in hand, her bag held close against her side. The timestamp blinked twice and then the frame ended. That was it. Those few seconds froze themselves into the town's memory forever because nothing about those final moments looked unusual. No struggle, no fear, no sign of danger. Yet Maren never made it home. Her mother called her phone repeatedly. Her younger brother drove the route she always took. Her coworker who lived nearby even walked outside to check if she had perhaps stopped by, but there was no sign of her. By sunrise the next morning, the town of Riverton was thrown into a quiet panic. The general store manager arrived early that morning, noticed Maren's car still parked there untouched, frost collected across the windows, and immediately knew something was wrong. Maren was the kind of person who never left her car anywhere except home or work. The manager called the police even before unlocking the store doors. Officers arrived, examined the vehicle, found her bag still in the backseat with her little poetry journal tucked between notebooks, and instantly launched a missing person search that grew larger by the hour. Maren wasn't the type to stay out late, wasn't the type to ignore calls, and certainly wasn't the type to vanish without a single explanation. Neighbors gathered almost immediately. A group of college students distributed flyers across town. Volunteers began checking back roads, wooded trails, and areas near the lake. People showed up with flashlights and warm drinks, ready to help. Even the mayor joined in the search. Riverton was small enough that everyone felt the absence of one girl. As the hours passed, fear settled deeper, but so did determination. The community pushed on, hoping Maren would be found safe, maybe injured or lost, maybe stuck somewhere her phone couldn't get service. But when the first full day ended with no sign of her, all optimism began slipping quietly away. One of the earliest strange pieces of information came from a man named Clarence who lived near a curve of the lake road. He said he had seen a vehicle around 9:30 p.m., a dark-colored truck parked near the old boat launch with its engine running and its lights turned off. He didn't think much of it at the time because fishermen often went out at odd hours. He only mentioned it when he heard Maren was missing. His description, though vague, was noted by investigators. But because he couldn't recall the model or plate or even the exact shade of the truck, nothing concrete could be drawn from his sighting. The detail was filed like dozens of other small details. What no one realized then was that Clarence's memory, faint and incomplete, held the key to the entire case. But it would take 19 years for that key to be recognized. Within the first week, investigators questioned coworkers, neighbors, former classmates, and anyone who had seen Maren that evening. They looked into a recent break-in attempt reported at a shop not far from the general store, but there was no overlap. They reviewed footage from nearby businesses, but cameras were limited and most footage was too grainy to reveal anything useful. They searched the banks of Pine Harbor Lake, hopping for a clue, but found nothing except the quiet ripple of water against old docks. As each day passed, Fear thickened through town like cold fog. Parents picked up their children from school instead of letting them walk home. Women avoided late errands. People kept porch lights glowing deep into the night. Maren's family held together as best they could. Her mother tried to stay strong, her father barely slept, and her brother kept returning to the same stretch of road, hoping somehow he had missed something. But the longer she remained missing, the more unbearable the silence became. Then one afternoon, 5 days after her disappearance, a teacher walking her dog along a wooded trail found something half buried under leaves. Maren's keychain with the little brass moon charm she never went anywhere without. Police flooded the area, marking the ground, looking for prints or tracks. They found a partial footprint but couldn't be certain if it belonged to anyone involved. Then, near a split tree trunk, they found her store ID card. On the lanyard, a faint possible touch DNA residue was collected and sealed in hopes that maybe someday science would be strong enough to identify it. The biggest twist from that week came from the person least suspected of anything, a man named Devin Caro. He was 31 then, a hardware store employee known for helping elderly neighbors with repairs, known for speaking politely at town gatherings, and known for being the first to organize the search parties for Maren. He printed flyers, brought food to volunteers, checked in on Maren's parents daily, and even stood at vigils with tears in his eyes. People praised him for how devoted he was to finding her. He even reassured the family repeatedly, saying, "We won't stop, not until she's back." No one questioned his intentions. Why would they? He seemed like a kind, giving man, genuinely broken by the disappearance of a girl he barely knew. At least that's what everyone believed. By the end of November, investigators were running out of leads. They questioned drifters, reviewed calls, interviewed drivers who passed through during that hour, and still nothing aligned. For a small town unaccustomed to tragedy, the idea that someone within their own community could have taken a young woman was almost too difficult to accept. So the case slipped slowly toward cold. Officers still checked on tips, but each one fell apart. When winter deepened, search efforts halted. Snow covered the woods where volunteers once walked shoulder to shoulder, and the lake froze in a still, glass-like sheet. Life continued, even though everyone knew something was missing. Someone was missing. Riverton held its breath for months, then years. In 2013, nearly a decade later, a small update finally surfaced. The stored lanyard was retested using improved DNA processing. A partial male profile was recovered, but it was incomplete, only a fragment, not enough to search against databases or identify a person. Yet investigators held on to it, hoping one day technology might give them a miracle. For Maren's family, the news reopened old wounds. Hope returned, but in a painful, fragile form that offered no closure. Still, her mother placed a candle every year on the store's doorstep on November 3rd, whispering a promise that she would never stop searching. By 2023, many people believed the case would remain unsolved forever. Then the Michigan Cold Case Division adopted a more advanced genealogy tool, a system capable of scanning genetic fragments and matching them to distant biological relatives across public genealogy platforms. The moment Detective Rowan Tate fed Maren's fragment of touch DNA into the system, he expected nothing. Cold cases rarely revived fully after so much time. But 2 days later, an alert appeared on his screen. The tool had matched the fragment to a cluster of relatives belonging to a specific family line living in Michigan. The closest matches pointed directly to the Caro family. Detective Tate stared at the screen as the names appeared one by one. These weren't strangers. These were people from Riverton, people he grew up seeing at church picnics. And right in the center of the match cluster was the name that made his pulse stop, Devin Caro. The same Devin who led search parties. The same Devin who stood with candles at vigils. The same Devin who hugged Maren's mother and promised they would never stop looking. The genealogy tool's match suggested that the male DNA on Maren's lanyard came from someone extremely close to Devin. Close enough that only one conclusion made sense. The sample likely belonged to Devin himself or someone virtually identical in genetic profile. Detective Tate's hands trembled. For 19 years, the town believed Devon was one of the helpers, one of the comforting voices, one of the kindest volunteers, and now the evidence whispered a completely different truth. A truth too cold, too sharp, too unbelievable to accept without absolute confirmation. And as Tate stared at the screen, one thought formed clearly in his mind. If the genealogy result was accurate, the person Riverton trusted the most might have been the person who took Maren in the first place. This was only the beginning. For weeks after the old evidence was shipped from storage to the Michigan State Crime Lab, the quiet town of Marlow Ridge felt as if the air itself was holding its breath. People went about their routines, morning coffee, late shifts at the mill, evenings on front porches, but something beneath it all felt unsettled. It wasn't just the reopening of the file. It was the name written at the top of it, the one people had avoided for years because saying it out loud always felt like reopening a wound that never closed. The name belonged to a young woman whose smile people still remembered even after 2 decades. Her name was Helena Ward, a 23-year-old art student whose death changed the town more than anyone admitted. As new technology began touching the old evidence, her story quietly stirred back to life. Detective Rowan Hale kept the case file on his desk instead of filing it away like the others. He said it was because he needed it close, but truthfully, something about Helena's face had settled into a corner of his mind he couldn't push aside. Her photograph was soft and sunlit, taken during the spring festival just months before everything changed. She was holding a paintbrush, laughing, unaware that the future had already begun moving toward her like a shadow she couldn't see coming. Rowan often stared at it before leaving the station, feeling something tighten in his chest each time. Inside the lab miles away, microscopic traces left on a strand of fabric were examined beneath high-resolution imaging machinery that didn't exist in 2004. The technician, a woman named Clarissa Main, studied the partial genetic markers that surfaced onto her computer with steady eyes. They weren't enough for a match, but they were enough to build a genetic profile that could be placed into the genealogical database used for cold cases. Clarissa knew cases like this were unpredictable. Sometimes they led nowhere. Sometimes they exploded open with a single name. She didn't know yet which direction Helena's case would take, but there was something unusual about the markers, something faintly familiar in structure. She sent the file forward. 2 weeks later, just after dawn, Rowan received the kind of call detectives remember for the rest of their careers. Clarissa's voice came through the phone calm but urgent. The genealogical software had found a link. Not a parent, not a sibling, but something more complicated. A close relative whose family tree held a name that hadn't appeared in any interviews from 2004. It was a name from a branch that split unexpectedly, a line connected to someone who lived in Marlow Ridge at the time Helena died, but who mysteriously moved away 4 months later. Rowan felt a pulse of adrenaline as he wrote the information down. If this relative was who he thought it might be, the truth they'd been chasing for 19 years was suddenly standing within reach. The new name on the list was Alden Rusk, a man Rowan barely recognized until he dug through old town records and realized Alden had once been a quiet resident who kept mostly to himself. He had worked at a construction site during the year Helena died. People remembered him as polite but distant, someone who rarely stayed long in conversations. He lived in a small rental near the north edge of town and left abruptly after the fall semester began. No one had questioned it at the time. People left Marlow Ridge often, especially young men looking for better jobs. But now the database was whispering a possibility the old investigation had missed. Rowan knew he couldn't ignore it. When he drove out to question the family linked to Alden, he felt the weight of the moment pressing against him. The house belonged to Alden's cousin, a middle-aged woman named Drusilla Ward, who welcomed Rowan into her living room with visible confusion. She hadn't heard Helena's name in years, and when he mentioned it, she pressed her hand to her mouth as if the memory hit too suddenly. He asked about Alden, and something flickered across her expression, a brief tension, like a piece of truth she didn't want to hold. She admitted she hadn't spoken to Alden in over a decade and wasn't aware of his exact whereabouts. But her voice wavered when she said he always had difficulty forming long-term friendships, that he struggled with sudden anger and often disappeared for days without telling anyone. Rowan didn't need more than that. He saw the fear at the edges of her silence, the unspoken words she wasn't ready to say. Back at the station, Rowan dug deeper into Alden's work history and discovered that on the night Helena disappeared, Alden had clocked out unusually early. His supervisor at the time reported that he looked unsettled, as if something had rattled him. Yet none of this had made it into the original reports because Alden wasn't considered relevant back then. Rowan's pulse quickened. The small details were beginning to line up, forming a crooked but undeniable path toward a man who had almost slipped through history. The twist came later that same night when Rowan received another update from the lab. The genealogical tool had refined the match further, this time using advanced filtering mechanisms added to the system only a year earlier. The new correlation was sharper. It narrowed the genetic proximity down to a possibility Rowan did not expect at all. The technician revealed the true significance. The closest match was Alden himself. It was Alden's younger brother, Lysander Rusk, who had also lived in Marlow Ridge briefly before moving to Ohio in 2005. His name had never surfaced in the original documents. He had not been interviewed. He had not even been considered. Rowan sat silently for a moment after the call. The room felt still. He remembered Helena's photograph resting on his desk, the one where she looked like she was caught in a moment of joy. He wondered how many times cases like hers went unfinished because someone with a calm smile had slipped unnoticed through the edges of an investigation. The revelation that the genetic markers pointed more strongly to Lysander added a sudden sharpness to the case. If he had been nearby during that summer, if he had crossed paths with Helena even once, everything that happened that night could take on a new shape. The next morning, Rowan drove to Ohio. The address was outdated but still provided a starting point. The apartment building was quiet, the hallways dim. Lysander no longer lived there, but a neighbor remembered him, a man with an odd way of standing too still during conversations, someone who avoided eye contact and always seemed like he was listening to something far away. Rowan's instincts sharpened. He continued the search across the city, piecing together small fragments from places Lysander had worked. A mechanic shop remembered him for his precision with tools, but said he left without warning one day. A diner said he used to sit alone for hours, staring at nothing in particular. None of it was enough for proof, but each detail added subtle shadows to a picture that was becoming harder to ignore. When Rowan finally located Lysander in a small industrial town outside Toledo, the meeting began quietly. Lysander was loading wooden planks onto a truck when Rowan approached him. There was nothing unusual about him at first glance. He was calm, almost gentle-looking, with a voice that carried a faint roughness. But the moment Rowan mentioned Helena's name, Lysander's expression shifted in a way that felt too practiced, too controlled. It was the kind of shift detectives learn to recognize. A person can hide their emotions, but the first second, the one where their muscles respond before their mind catches up, often reveals the truth. In that brief instant, Rowan saw a flicker of recognition, followed by a carefully blank stare. Lysander denied knowing Helena. He denied being in the area that night. He denied everything with a softness that felt rehearsed. But Rowan wasn't there for a confession. He was there to collect presence, mannerisms, irregularities, and anything that could connect Lysander back to the genetic match. When Rowan left, he felt certain the case had begun closing in on something long buried. Back in Marlow Ridge, word of the genetic discovery began spreading quietly, but no one had official details. People whispered at grocery aisles, outside the post office, near the park where Helena once painted landscapes. Some feared the truth. Some desperately hoped for it. and some prayed for closure because the silence of not knowing had become heavier than the truth itself. A breakthrough arrived 2 weeks later when Rowan returned with a warrant to obtain a voluntary DNA sample from Lysander. The sample was tested against the newly analyzed evidence, and 3 days later, the results came back with a probability so high that Rowan felt chilled reading the figures. The match wasn't absolute yet, but it was close enough that investigators knew they were finally nearing the center of a story that had haunted the town for 19 years. Rowan sat alone in his car that night, the file open on the passenger seat. Rain tapped against the windshield in long, steady threads. He pictured Helena walking home on that warm August night, unaware that someone she barely knew, or perhaps didn't know at all, had been watching her. He wondered what she saw in her last moments, what she might have thought. He wished he could somehow take the fear out of those final seconds, even though he knew he couldn't. All he could do was fight for the justice she was owed. Just when Rowan believed he understood the outline of the truth, another twist surfaced. Clarissa contacted him again to explain an anomaly. The match wasn't pointing solely to Lysander. It was showing shared markers consistent with two children from the same family line. The genetic distribution suggested that the person responsible might not be the younger brother or the older brother alone. It could be someone related more closely than either had admitted, someone whose name hadn't yet been identified. It meant one thing: the family was holding secrets. The revelation added tension to the investigation because Rowan now had to consider the possibility that the truth had been hidden intentionally, not only by the suspect but by those around him. He returned to question Drusilla again, and this time she hesitated longer before speaking. Her eyes lowered, her hands trembled, and finally she admitted something she hadn't been ready to say earlier. Lysander and Alden had grown up in a home filled with quiet volatility. Their father had been unpredictable. Their mother often shielded them from the worst moments. And sometimes, when things got too tense, one of the brothers would disappear for hours, wandering through the fields outside town. But there was something else, something Drusilla whispered only after Rowan promised complete confidentiality. She said there was another relative who had been close to the brothers that year, someone whose name wasn't widely known because he spent most of his time moving between jobs in different counties. A cousin named Merrick Rusk. The moment she said the name, Rowan felt a shift in the investigation so sharp that he leaned forward without thinking. Merrick had been 19 in 2004 and had reportedly stayed with the brothers for several weeks during the summer Helena disappeared. This was the missing piece. Rowan left the house with his heart beating fast. Every thread in the case was twisting together into a shape he hadn't expected when he reopened the file. The genealogy tool had guided them toward a ghost hiding at the edge of the family tree, a man who wasn't even in town records because he didn't stay long enough to appear. The answer had been buried not in the obvious branches, but in the forgotten ones. As Rowan drove back toward the station, he felt a strange mix of anticipation and sorrow. He could feel the story building toward something final, something inevitable. The truth was almost there, so close that he could sense it pressing against the edges of the silence that had surrounded Helena's case for nearly 2 decades. And somewhere out there, Merrick Rusk was living his life unaware that the past he thought he outrun was now reaching straight toward him. The search for Merrick Rusk began before sunrise, with a quiet tension hanging inside the station, as if everyone sensed that the final stretch of the 19-year chase was approaching. The genealogical data had pointed to him with unsettling precision, and Rowan Hale knew that once a name reached this stage of the investigation, there was usually no turning back. But what unsettled him most wasn't the evidence. It was imagining Helena Ward walking through that warm August night unaware that the person who would change her fate might not have been someone familiar, or someone she crossed paths with regularly, but a drifting cousin who arrived in town for only a short time and left without leaving even a whisper behind. The idea that Helena's final moments could tie to a stranger who didn't even belong to Marlow Ridge made Rowan's chest tight. As he started the car, and drove toward the trail Merrick had unknowingly left scattered across 2 decades. The first lead took him to a lumber mill in Wisconsin, where Merrick had worked briefly 6 years earlier. The foreman remembered him well, not because he caused trouble, but because he always seemed restless, as if he were waiting for something to happen or waiting for an opportunity to leave. Rowan listened carefully, sensing that people like Merrick didn't leave emotional footprints, only small fragments, quick jobs, rented rooms, and months of quiet disappearance. When Rowan asked whether Merrick had ever mentioned Michigan or family, the foreman said he only recalled Merrick once saying he didn't stay close to anyone and didn't return to places he'd already been. That sentence stayed with Rowan long after he left. The next lead came from a rental invoice in Illinois tied to Merrick's name, showing he lived there for 4 months before leaving without collecting his last paycheck. The property owner remembered him as polite but distant, someone who stood outside at night staring at the empty field behind the building. Rowan imagined him there, silent, unmoving, eyes fixed on the dark horizon like a man trying to silence something inside. The owner also mentioned something strange. Merrick had kept a wooden box under his bed, always locked, and he carried it with him when he left. No one knew what was in it. Rowan wrote the detail down, feeling a flicker of dread for reasons he couldn't yet explain. As Rowan followed the trail across states, he sensed that the story was building toward something heavy, something Merrick had carried for 19 years without ever letting it surface. But the closer Rowan came, the more he felt the weight of Helena's memory pushing him forward. He often pictured her walking through the campus grounds with her sketchbooks pressed against her chest, or laughing with friends at the cafe downtown. These images strengthened his resolve each time exhaustion threatened to turn him back. The investigation took a turn when Rowan found a recent employment record in Indiana. Merrick had worked at an auto body shop there until 3 months ago. The shop owner described Merrick as skilled with repairs, but always uneasy when customers stood too close. He often stepped away when people tried to start casual conversations. The owner also remembered a day when Merrick excused himself abruptly after seeing a news segment about cold case arrests made through genealogy. Merrick had shut the TV off so quickly that the owner never forgot it. That moment lit a spark in Rowan's mind. People who ran from technology usually ran from something more than privacy. They ran from truth. With each new detail, Rowan felt as if he were chasing a shadow that kept slipping between cracks, each one narrower than the last. But fate has a way of aligning itself when a story is ready to end. 2 weeks later, a traffic citation revealed Merrick was living in a small cabin outside a rural town in Minnesota. It was isolated, surrounded by thick pines, the kind of place a man chose when he wanted to be alone with whatever memories refused to leave him. Rowan knew he had finally reached the point where chance ended and confrontation began. He did not go alone. 3 officers accompanied him, though Rowan felt strangely solitary as he stepped toward the cabin. The sunlight was fading and the trees cast long shadows across the ground. The air smelled like pine and cold earth. Rowan knocked once, twice, then a third time. Inside, footsteps approached slowly, hesitantly, like someone deciding whether to face whatever waited outside. When the door opened, Merrick Rusk stood in the doorway, looking older than his record suggested. His hair had grown unevenly, his eyes were tired, and there was a stillness in him that made Rowan uneasy. People who carried guilt sometimes held their bodies that way, too quietly, as if noise alone could shatter them. Rowan introduced himself calmly and explained the purpose of his visit. Merrick didn't react much. His face barely changed, but Rowan saw something flicker beneath the surface, a recognition, faint but unmistakable. When Rowan mentioned Helena's name, Merrick dropped his gaze, not in shock or confusion, but in resignation. It was the reaction of someone who had expected this day to arrive eventually and had simply hoped it never would. Rowan asked again if he remembered her, and Merrick whispered that he remembered the summer but claimed he didn't recall meeting her. The lie was thin, too thin, a fragile layer stretched over something much darker. The officers waited outside while Rowan requested permission to look around. To Rowan's surprise, Merrick let him in without protest. The cabin was clean but sparse. A cot, a small burner stove, stacks of mechanical journals, and near the corner, a wooden box. The same box the landlord mentioned years earlier. The sight of it pulled something heavy through Rowan's chest. He asked what was inside, and Merrick's shoulders tightened. Rowan didn't touch it yet. Instead, he asked if Merrick would consent to providing a DNA sample to help clear up the genealogical confusion. Merrick nodded slowly, but Rowan sensed his agreement was not a sign of innocence. It felt more like surrender. Back at the lab, Clarissa worked urgently. The sample underwent immediate comparison with the recovered trace markers from Helena's evidence. Rowan waited in the hallway, packing, his pulse loud in his ears. The lights hummed softly, and every minute stretched into something long and fragile. When Clarissa finally stepped out, her expression held the gravity of truth. The match was undeniable, far stronger than the ones linked to Lysander or Alden. 99.9% probability. Merrick Rusk had been at the center of the genetic trail the entire time. Rowan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the results settle in. There was no relief, not yet. Only the raw ache of knowing Helena's story was about to be retold through the voice of the man who had taken her future. He returned to Minnesota with an arrest warrant, feeling the world tilt slightly as he approached the same cabin once more. Merrick didn't resist. He sat quietly as officers led him outside, glancing around as though memorizing the trees, the sky, the fading afternoon light. Rowan watched him carefully. There was no violence in him, no anger, not even fear. Only a strange softness, like a man who had been living with something unbearable for years and now, finally, felt it loosening from his grip. At the station, when Rowan asked him to explain what happened 19 years earlier, Merrick hesitated for a long time. His silence stretched until Rowan worried he might never speak. But then, with a trembling breath, Merrick began to talk. His voice was uneven, breaking at certain moments as though he was forcing himself to relive memories he had buried deep. He said he had come to Marlow Ridge that summer to find work and escape tension at home. He often walked at night to clear his head. That was how he encountered Helena, once near the art building as she carried her sketchbooks, again near the cafe, and finally on the night she disappeared. He said he never intended to approach her, but something inside him felt drawn to her light, the kind of brightness he had never known. He followed her from a distance that night, not thinking clearly, carried by emotions he couldn't explain. When she noticed someone behind her, she turned. The moment their eyes met, she looked startled, frightened. He tried to speak, to explain he didn't want anything, but his panic took over. Everything spiraled fast and uncontrolled until he lost sense of himself. When it was over, he froze, terrified of what he had done. He fled town the next morning and never returned. Rowan listened silently, the words heavy and cold as they filled the room. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. He owed Helena that much. When Merrick finished, his voice barely a whisper, Rowan felt an ache spread through his chest, not sympathy, but the sad understanding that some shadows grow inside people long before the world ever sees them. At trial, the courtroom was packed. People who remembered Helena sat beside younger residents who had only heard stories about her. Her family attended every session, holding onto each other quietly. Rowan sat behind them, feeling the weight of every year they had waited. The genealogy evidence was presented with clarity, the DNA match detailed with scientific certainty. Merrick's own confession sealed the final cracks. Jurors deliberated for only a few hours before delivering a unanimous verdict. When the judge announced the sentence, a breath passed through the room like a long-held storm finally breaking. It wasn't celebration. No one felt joy in that moment. It was something quieter, something like the release of a sorrow carried for far too long. Helena's family held hands. One of her cousins wept softly, and Rowan felt the kind of bittersweet ache detectives rarely admit aloud, the relief of justice arriving, mixed with the sadness that it could never bring back the life taken. Months later, Rowan visited the small memorial near the lake where Helena used to paint. It remained simple, fresh flowers, river stones, and a framed print of one of her landscapes. Rowan placed a single white rose beside it and stood quietly, letting the wind move around him. The town felt different now, not healed but less burdened. People spoke her name again without lowering their voices. Her story, once frozen in time, had found completion. As Rowan walked back to his car, he felt the case settling inside him, not disappearing but finding its place. Some stories leave marks that stay forever, not to burden but to remind. And Helena's story, filled with talent, hope, and a light that should have lasted far longer, became one of those marks. Her justice had come at last, through truth rising from silence, through science powerful enough to reach 19 years into the past, and through the unwavering belief that no story is ever too old to be solved.